Buenas tardes. Good evening. My name is Jody Rory, and on behalf of the board of the Hurricane Maria Assistance and Relief Institution Alliance, welcome to the inaugural Diversity in Medicine Pipeline Program Cyber Speaker Series, which we are proud to have created with the American College of Surgeons Operation Giving Back. We're elated to work with the 4 medical schools in Puerto Rico to provide important networking opportunities to pre-med students, medical students, and medical residents in Puerto Rico. We are honored to be in the presence of David Hoyt, Executive Director of the American College of Surgeons today. And I am really fortunate to work with our amazing team of ACS fellows, including Michael Lekawa, Matthew Dolich, Richard Lynn, Sandra Freewald, Jorge Martinez Traval, and our amazing program coordinator, Cayetana Lascano Echevarne, on our diversity projects. A special thank you to Dr. Gurma Tefera, Medical Director of Operation Giving Back, for partnering with us in 2017, post-Hurricane Maria, to support Puerto Rico, and we would like to recognize the thousands of lives lost post-natural disaster and take a moment of silence to also recognize our beloved Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We're going to take a moment right now. Thank you. I would like to share with you a personal story that may help you understand my inspiration behind the creation of our diversity medicine program. I'm one of millions across the world celebrating the life of our beloved Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and dedicate this panel to her today. I first met Justice Ginsburg in 1994 during my first ever visit at the US Supreme Court. She addressed a group of college students, and I was one of them. During the Q&A, Justice Ginsburg encouraged student engagement. I raised my hand and amassed the strength to pour my heart out to her in front of a room of strangers with the hope that she would save me. I had 6 months to intern somewhere in DC, but was being provided little guidance by the organization I paid to place me. She called on me, and when I presented what I deemed to be the best oral argument in my life, I explained to her that I was a first-generation, low-income, bilingual, Puerto Rican female college student who attended Rutgers University, an institution that we had in common. Like her, I explained, I simply needed an opportunity, but my pleas continuously fell on deaf ears. I stated that I felt that as a Jewish female who had endured so many obstacles, she would understand my situation. I explained that if she provided me an internship placement, I would work my hardest to make her proud of her decision, and I would pay it forward. She turned to her public information officer, Tony House, and whispered in her ear. Tony would later share with me that Justice Ginsburg asked her to make that happen. Because of the opportunity Justice Ginsburg gave me, I became the first Latinx intern in the Supreme Court of Public Information Office, a Puerto Rican. I would eventually go on to intern with the clerk of the US Supreme Court, worked hard, and always stayed late to learn. The opportunity to observe the informal engagements between the justices taught me that working together, no matter our differences, mattered. Watching the court in session confirmed my interest in learning more about the law. This experience provided me access that no one in my community had ever had before. And the exposure I would gain would change my life and the lives of my family and my community forever. We today hope to change your exposure through our program offerings. We hope to encourage you and provide you with the support and reassurance that I received. None of what I learned would have been possible without Justice Ginsburg's decision to create this opportunity for me. Later, I would pursue a PhD, and the court would write about my successes in their archived newsletter. I was just a young Puerto Rican woman in need of an opportunity. She bet on me, and since my experience at the court, I have worked to create a pipeline of opportunities for underrepresented and diverse aspiring lawyers, and now aspiring doctors and surgeons. I believe this espouses the essence of the life Justice Ginsburg has led. After enduring Hurricanes Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico with my children and working with the American College of Surgeons, I believe that we could replicate the same opportunities for medical students in Puerto Rico. It was fellows like Germa, Mike, and Sandy, and Richard, and Matt that believed it too, and they never said no. Students like Cayetana that never gave up and worked endlessly to help make this happen. And fellows like Dr. Jorge Martinez Trabal in Puerto Rico, who was always there for us. Hence, HMARIA was formed for the charitable purposes of disrupting poverty and creating the next generation of leaders in law and medicine. Justice Ginsburg provided me with a life-altering opportunity that has disrupted poverty in my life, the life of my family, and has made this program possible, changing the lives of all it touches. May she live through our program, and may those who pass through it serve proudly in her memory. It's our hope that we can provide opportunities to each of you by leveling the playing field. A special thank you to the doctors and nurses who helped keep her healthy so she could make amazing contributions to our society. Thank you so much for joining us. We are elated to be part of your educational endeavors, and I would like to now turn over the program to our beloved Cayetana Lascano Echevarne, our future MD PhD.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos, todas y todes. Yo voy a estar dando un mensaje en español porque aquí somos bilingües, así que para no olvidarnos del español. Muchas gracias a todos, a todas y a todos por estar esta tarde con nosotros. Primero que nada, quisiera enfatizar que un día como ayer, hace 3 años, el huracán María pasó por Puerto Rico, como ya sabemos, dejando mucha destrucción, fallecidos y dolor. Esta organización es solo una pequeña muestra del amor que le tenemos a nuestra isla y a nuestra gente. Como muchos y muchas saben, la doctora Jody Roure fue visionaria y no descansó hasta hacer esto posible. Comenzamos con Doctors for Maria Relief, haciendo brigadas de más de 12 horas con doctores y doctoras, enfermeros y enfermeras y estudiantes voluntarios y voluntarias apenas semanas del paso del huracán. Luego, en afiliación con el Colegio Americano de Cirujanos, fundamos el programa Operation Giving Back Puerto Rico, donde atendimos a más de 200 pacientes y realizamos más de 50 intervenciones quirúrgicas a personas sin seguro médico. Dado el COVID-19, tuvimos que ponerle una pausa a este proyecto, pero eso no nos detuvo. Una de nuestras grandes metas siempre fue y será ayudar a elevar y apoyar a nuestros estudiantes de premédica, medicina y médicos residentes puertorriqueños y puertorriqueñas. Así que comenzamos este Diversity in Medicine Pipeline Program. Sabemos la necesidad que hay entre los y las estudiantes locales para hacer networking, y más en estos tiempos, y queremos aportar nuestro granito de arena. Ha sido una de las mejores aventuras trabajar junto a 2 personas que admiro tanto, a la doctora Jody y la doctora Sandy, quienes han dado la milla extra para hacer esto posible. También quiero agradecer al Dr. David Hoyt por ser pionero en este Cyber Lecture Series, al Dr. Gilma Tefera, director médico de Operation Giving Back, por confiar en nosotros, al exsecretario de Salud, Dr. Rafael Rodríguez, a la Junta Directiva de HMARIA, en especial al Dr. Mike Lecoa, Dr. Richard Lynn, Matt Dulwich, Dr. Jorge Martínez Trabal, por su apoyo constante, y a las escuelas de medicina locales, incluyendo a la doctora Olga Martínez y el doctor Aníbal Torres de Ponce, la doctora Waleska Crespo y doctora Diana Fernández de UCC, la doctora Ada Cortés de San Juan Bautista y el doctor Mesa Guillot de UPR Ciencias Médicas, por acompañarnos en esta linda travesía. Para mí es un honor y un orgullo poder ser la coordinadora de este gran programa, que significa tanto para mí como estudiante de primera generación y estudiante internacional. No se olviden de darnos follow en nuestras redes sociales, en Facebook, Instagram y Twitter, para las próximas actividades, porque vamos a estar continuando con esta serie cada 2 semanas. And now, I'll let you with Dr. Freewald.
Hi, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Hoyt, who will be giving us a lecture today entitled Resuscitation, Past Beliefs and Current Clinical Trials. Dr. Hoyt was my teacher and mentor many years ago when I did a trauma surgery fellowship at the University of California, San Diego. So we go way back. Dr. Hoyt obtained his medical degree from Case Western University School of Medicine in Cleveland, Ohio. He did all of his training at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine and remained at UCSD until 2006. While there, Dr. Hoyt was the director of the Division of Trauma, Burns, and Critical Care. He was instrumental in the development of the San Diego County Trauma System, and that's one of his greatest legacies. In 2006, Dr. Hoyt became the chair of the Department of Surgery at UC Irvine and the executive vice dean of the School of Medicine there. And in 2010, he became the executive director of the American College of Surgeons, a position he holds today. So without further ado, let's listen to his talk. And Dr. Hoyt will be joining us at the end of the lecture for a period of questions and answers. So please feel free to ask him any questions that are raised by his talk. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to be with you today. I look forward to visiting sometime in the near future. Today we're going to talk about resuscitation, and we're going to focus on what we've believed about resuscitation through the years and go way back in time to understand where this came from, and then move into a more modern time where we've conducted clinical trials to try and sort out some of the questions that have evolved historically with regard to resuscitating patients following injury. Now, the traditional focus has been to think of resuscitation as giving fluid. As you can see in this bottle scene from a picture from USA Today during the Iraq invasion, you have a pre-hospital provider starting an IV, the IV bag prominent, obvious injury to the casualty. And the whole message here is that this is what we do first for patients when they've been severely injured. If you go back though and think about this, the goals of resuscitation have changed over time. And this has gone from the concept of resuscitating the lost volume from bleeding to moving toward a concept of delivering oxygen to make up the oxygen debt that occurs following shock. Or more recently, we have worried about reestablishing hemostasis in a patient that has bled excessively, where coagulation factors, hypothermia, and acidosis have prevented normal clotting. So each of these three priorities has led us to choose resuscitation strategies from the use of saline to fresh whole blood. And we're going to go through where we stand today based on that long history. Now, if you go back to the beginning of really organized medicine, for centuries, the concept of treating disease was really to deal with the bad spirits that were causing the disease. So initial concepts such as exonerating a patient from disease, or the concept of the witch doctor shaking and rattling a device to get the spirits to go away, or even trephination, releasing through a hole in the skull bad spirits in the brain, were all in line with that kind of thinking. Similarly, there was an error in reasoning that occurred And that's referred to in Latin as post hoc ergo propter hoc. And it simply means that if you get sick and you take a medicine and you get better, that after it, therefore, because we assume that the treatment was effective. But that does not necessarily follow, and it does not mean that the second happened because of the first. But that is empiric reasoning that we've used for the last 4,000 years to guide treatment. And it's only recently that we've been able to move away from that. Now, from resuscitation, it's a relatively new field. If you look at the Iliad, written by Homer, there are 150 wounds described, and of those, 3/4 of those wounds died. If you looked at the mortality of gunshot wounds in Chicago or Houston this weekend, you would find that about 3/4 of patients die at the scene or in the first hour or two of injury. So what it says is that when you have significant bleeding, resuscitation is not going to necessarily capture everyone. And as a result, it's a relatively new field. If you go back in time, perhaps 2,000 years, really treatment involved the application of herbs, removing arrows, casting fractures, but trauma care resuscitation, the way we think of it today, is very, very recent. Now, a principle with regard to learning about how to treat casualties has come from the study of war and of history. And if you go back to Alexander the Great, 330 BC, as he started his conquests around the Middle East, he had been trained by Aristotle when he was a young man in Greece, and he was trained to take what they called naturalists or scientists to accompany him. And through that, they spread Greek medicine throughout the world at the time, but they also used the availability of these people to do research on battle injuries during conflict and establish the concept of using war to develop an understanding of what kind of treatment can be used. And that's a tradition that has gone on since that time. If you look at another example of this, we think of far forward care, providing care up to the front line is relatively new. There you see the echelons in line in the desert going into Baghdad with the healthcare facilities moving in. But in fact, the fresco on the left shows a Roman being bandaged in the field by what we would consider today a paramedic. So again, these concepts, although they are very modern in some regards, are also really have been there all along. Now, to understand resuscitation, you have to go back to the original theory of our understanding of circulation. And for almost 2,000 years, we were under a misconception that was started by Galen. Galen was a very forceful and very convincing surgeon. He had been trained in 131 AD. And his theory of circulation was that food went to the liver, it was converted into blood, blood was then released into arteries and pumped by the heart to veins, and that's how basically blood flow occurred. It was not a circulation, it was a unilateral flow. Therefore, when a patient was sick or felt uncomfortable, was so-called congested, the concept of draining blood became a therapeutic way to treat patients. And it started 2,000 years ago, and it predominated well into the 20th century. Now, another thing that's interesting is to think about the change in the world from the early several centuries of AD, so up to about 400 or 500 AD, when Christianity dominated what was the inhabited world at the time, and then transformed around 700 to 800 AD into being dominated essentially by Arabic-speaking cultures. And how did the change in religion, the practice of religion, changed the understanding of medicine? And in fact, it did not change really very much at all. Latin was transcribed into Arabic, Galen's concepts of bloodletting were shared by Avicenna, the great Arabian physician, and they only simply bled on the opposite side of a symptom. But the concept of bloodletting survived even the great transformation of religious activity during the first millennium. Now, to get some insight into how physicians were feeling, this is a quote from Avicenna's Canon, which was his medical encyclopedia, and it was done somewhere around the end of the first millennium. And he suggested that two opposed cases be observed and that the study be made in time and that the reproducibility of the effects be studied. He was suggesting the concept of a modern clinical trial. And although it took many centuries for it to catch on completely, at least the concept was understood 1,000 years ago. Medicine, as we think of it, returned to Europe in about the same time. And it's said that Constantine of Carthage had learned medicine in Arabia and India. He became mistrusted. He mistrusted the people that were teaching him and escaped to Salerno, which is on the west coast of Italy, translated the Arabic back into Latin, and started the first medical school. And with that came the return of dissection and our ability to start actually understanding the anatomy and subsequently the physiology. The concept of a chairman comes from that, in that the chairman was the person that sat in the chair and read the concept of what to do during a dissection. Another insight comes from the Franciscan Roger Bacon in 1275. And it's basically an apology for the state of science in medicine at that time. And what he says is it's exceedingly difficult and dangerous to perform operations on the human body. For the practical sciences, by that he meant geometry, astronomy, physics, etc. They can do their work on insensate bodies and multiply their experiments till they get rid of deficiency and errors. But a physician cannot do this because of the nobility of the material in which he works. Physicians are to be excused for their defects more than other workers in the science. He was essentially invoking an apology for why we could not do science the way other science was being done. And that, again, is a good insight into why we were reluctant to do too much experimentation with humans in the form of clinical trials. Now, for resuscitation, it didn't matter a whole lot. You can see the oldest registry I can find, and this is from 1347. And you can see killed by a fall from the belfry at Alhalla's, the great church, 1, and plague, 7,165. So even though our interest in anatomy and physiology was beginning, the actual form of disease that we were dealing with was primarily infectious disease. Now, one of the things that changed that was the advent of gunshot wounds and the invention of gunpowder. And Ambrose Paré was a well-known surgeon in the 16th century who was focused on gunshot wounds and the infection caused by them. And his whole premise was to remove the infectious cause, remove the gunpowder, and he used boiling oil to cure by fire what could not be cured by knife. And what he actually did is one night he ran out of oil. So he had to dress the wounds with turpentine, and he flavored them with the petals of rose flowers. And he describes eloquently his concern that night that had he done the right thing as a physician, had he done wrong on behalf of his patients, and only to wake up the next morning and find that his patients were actually in better shape. So this is, again, one of the first evidence of an experiment being recorded and a physician being very thoughtful about changing treatment and postulating that something else would work. But still, shock was not a priority at this time. But the advent of the clinical trial took a step forward. Now, things started to go along more quickly during the more modern period of Europe. In the 16th century, Henry VIII allowed physicians who had been given sanction and surgeons who had been given a guild to join the right to dissect criminals who had been executed, and anatomy was able to start to be done. Still, bloodletting, as evidenced by the second publication from the Gutenberg Press, was the predominant way that things were being treated. But we started to establish anatomy and then physiology during this century. Vesalius is probably the one that did the most to develop our understanding of anatomy and establish the actual anatomic structures that circulation is dependent upon. He did this. He was actually challenged and ultimately burned his manuscripts, but his manuscripts survived, and his accurate representation of anatomy then became the basis of anatomic study going forward. He, however, could not explain right to left passage of blood. And it really then required the concept of physiology to be born. And some interesting people are involved in that. The first is Galileo. He was ultimately imprisoned by the Pope for his views about the Earth orbiting the sun, but he actually started out as a medical student and went to the school on the west coast of Italy at Pisa, one of the oldest medical schools in existence. They had a pendulum for the first time. They could time the pulse. And he learned how to measure the heart rate. And it was that observation that then several decades later allowed Harvey to challenge Galen. He could not demonstrate pores in the heart. He could not explain how the blood in the veins could get back to the arteries because they didn't understand the microcirculation. But what he did instead is he said that if Galen is right and that the liver is making blood, and the heart is pumping 60 cc's with each pulse by measuring the ejection volume, and then he calculated how many beats per minute and therefore how many minutes in a day, he calculated that you would have to create 16 tons of blood in 24 hours, and that was impossible. Therefore, Galen must be wrong, and therefore blood must circulate. So for the first time, we were starting to accept science in the mid-17th century. Now, there was an equivalent of a professional society called the Experimental Philosophy Club that existed at Oxford. Harvey was a member, and Wren was an architect who was a member. Boyle, the famous chemist, was a member. They would get together and talk about things. And based on these discussions with Harvey, Wren and Boyle collaborated. They injected antimony and opium subsequently into a dog and induced vomiting and sedation, and demonstrated that an intravenous injection must circulate and cause the symptoms. They then had a collaborator with a medical student, Lauer, who created a dog model to show that by sewing an artery to a vein, you could resuscitate one dog with another, and that one animal may live with the blood of another. So it really took till 1665 to understand this entire concept. Then a very interesting thing occurred, and this occurred in 1667 when Jean-Baptiste Denis, who was working in the French equivalent of the Intellectual Society, had his colleagues come over one day, and he had a patient that had been brought to him by the patient's wife, Antoine Maury. Mr. Maury was depressed. He surmised that if he transfused Mr. Maury with the blood of a lamb, that could help calm him. He did so. You can see this woodcut demonstrating the actual transfusion, and it actually worked. He subsequently did it 2 more times, and on the third one, he had what was probably the first transfusion reaction and died. At suit, his wife sued, and at court, it was proved that she was actually poisoning him. But in fact, the fact and the controversy that this may have been caused by the transfusion led both the French Parliament and the Pope at an international level to ban transfusion, which occurred for really almost the next 200 years. And as a result, bloodletting ruled. The Lancet Journal is named after the device that people use to bleed themselves. Benjamin Rush was sued. George Washington, our first president, probably was bled on his deathbed, 1/3 of his blood volume. And this was practiced well into the 20th century, even by William Osler. Now, crystalloid has a much shorter history. It's tied to, again, infectious disease. It was known from the ability to measure specific gravity that the blood of patients suffering cholera was concentrated, implying that they had lost a lot of fluid through the diarrhea. And so the concept of giving normal saline, subsequently modified normal saline with the addition of other electrolytes, was used during the great cholera epidemics. It was not subsequently used until the end of the 19th century for obstetrical hemorrhage. And then at the same time, approximately, the introduction of colloid, sometimes referred to as gum of acacia, was used to exploit the oncotic effect of a large complex molecule, and that became a component of resuscitation. Subsequently, lactate was added, et cetera. But the basis of crystalloid resuscitation was again tied back to infectious disease. Now, the first operative transfusion we can document occurred in New York City. And the two Lambert brothers were faculty at Columbia. One of them had a wife who had just given birth to a baby that had a hemolytic anemia and was going to die. Alex Carrel had been just recruited to the Rockefeller Institute in 1908. He had just arrived. He didn't even have a license in the United States yet. He, as a medical student, had observed that a surgeon had a problem anastomosing or repairing the portal vein following a stab wound, and used that observation to go on and experiment how to triangulate a vascular wound, and learned how to do a vascular anastomosis and many other innovative things that made him very attractive as a researcher. And he was recruited to Rockefeller Institute at its beginning to help with that. So the Lambert brothers knew that he had come to New York. They knew of his work in vascular anastomosis, and they asked him to come down to the house, and on the kitchen table, Dr. Carrel sewed the radial artery to the popliteal vein of the baby and saved the baby, and Carrel went on to celebrate that child's birthday 21 years later. So that's probably the first documented human transfusion that we can demonstrate. Other work was occurring in New York City at the same time, it turns out. Landsteiner had published ABO incompatibility and typing and crossing. Ottenberg at Mount Sinai Hospital had simplified that test and been able to test to avoid hemolysis. And his colleague just down the hall had determined that sodium citrate could be used to anticoagulate blood. So between the observations of these two scientists working in the same institution, the technique of blood transfusion was suddenly made as simple as saline transfusion. That's about the time that World War I then started. And as a continuation of the theme of deploying people into warfare, Walter Cannon, who was a MD physiologist at Harvard, was sent to study casualties during World War I. His concept of the understanding of traumatic shock was that it occurred due to dilated capillary beds, which he called ischemia, not due to blood loss per se. And so his theoretical basis of understanding this was different, but he was in charge of going into the battlefield and actually observing what was going on. And he contributed many things, as we'll see in a moment. One of the first things he contributed was the concept that if you started to resuscitate a patient and restore volume before you had surgical hemostasis, you could actually overcome primary hemostasis, which is platelet plugging, and pop the clot. And he describes this that in the concept that the injection of a fluid that will increase blood pressure has dangers in itself. Hemorrhage may not have occurred to the marked degree because the blood pressure has been too low to overcome the obstacle offered by a clot. However, if you raise blood pressure, then you could pop the clot. And he saw this and cautioned against it. He also saw the first use of blood transfusion, and he comments here that with this method of blood transfusion, I know that this hospital has saved lives. So again, we were starting to understand the importance about 100 years ago. Now, after World War I, there was very little progress made, with the exception of a famous surgeon, Alfred Blalock, who's known mostly for his contributions to heart surgery. But when he was a resident, he, along with Dr. Harrison of the famous Harrison's Internal Medicine text, they together collaborated and studied shock in animals and defined the relationship of blood loss to shock. This is the same concept we use in ATLS today, and they described that in the mid-20s. They also showed that volume resuscitation was critical. Being residents, being a slower publication cycle than we might have today, their observations went largely unnoticed for the next 25 years. Meanwhile, there was a lot of global instability. Germany under Hitler was starting to invade many parts of Europe. The Russians were also getting involved in the World War. And the United States initially stayed out of it, but Carrel, who'd been at Rockefeller for the last 20 years, had gone back to Paris to retire. And when Paris and France fell under the Germans, they needed blood. And Carrel was asked by his colleagues to reach out to the United States, which he did, and talk about how we could help with the supply of blood into the European theater. Blood at the time would not survive the transatlantic journey without becoming contaminated and infected. And the fractionation of blood into plasma was actually currently being developed and possible. Albumin was also available and was first used at Pearl Harbor by the famous surgeon Rabden. So because of those logistics, plasma, which Walter Cannon also felt was a appropriate resuscitation fluid, became the basic fluid that was used during the early part of World War II. It was then another deployed surgeon, Dr. Churchill, who went into the theater and observed that plasma, as he said, is not a blood substitute. He raised this controversy. He did it going contrary to the command at the time, but he was able to get people to realize that going to blood as a primary resuscitation fluid was probably the best thing. And by the end of World War II, blood was much more available. By the end of World War II, again, interest was lost. It took 70 days during the Korean War to even have blood supply in theater. They did, for the first time, note the coagulation problems associated with massive transfusion. During Vietnam, early evacuation allowed patients to be rapidly evacuated and massive resuscitation to be done, and coagulopathy really started to manifest itself for the first time. Based on that and those observations, Simmons and Collins, both of whom became chairman of surgery after the Vietnam conflict, came back and applied much of what they'd learned in war to a famous paper written in 1974. And they described how you treat resuscitation and how you treat coagulopathy by simply saying that what you give is a function of what you need. So if you need volume, you should give crystalloid. If you need red cells, you should give red cells. If you have a coagulation problem, you should be giving coagulation factors or platelets, but not to give it all at once. So fractionation was supported. That was accompanied in civilian use by a large amount of money being made by drug companies based on fractionating blood. Blood was being collected without much sensitivity to infection by hepatitis. AIDS was unknown at the time. So during the 60s, our predominant practice was to use fractionated component therapy, and the whole concept of using whole blood or restoring whole blood was lost for a period of time. Meanwhile, there was still a search for an understanding, a better understanding of shock. And Tom Shires and his colleagues did a classic experiment in 1963, which showed that in addition to restoring the intravascular volume, you actually had to resuscitate loss of fluid from individual cells. So the extracellular resuscitation of the extracellular space and the intracellular volume led to this concept that resuscitation has to be 3-to-1 for what is actually lost from the intravascular space. He tested that. He used a model and a mechanism of measuring those spaces using radioactive isotopes. And it turns out he presented that paper, that famous paper that changed the way we resuscitated, the day that President Kennedy was shot. And that's why he was not in Dallas that day. That concept then of crystalloid resuscitation using 3-to-1 is what became the standard resuscitation in the subsequent years. That was challenged by Dr. Shoemaker, who said that the target is not just to resuscitate the loss of volume, both intra and extravascular, but to restore the lost oxygen delivery. So if you think of shock as a period of time when oxygen was not adequately delivered, you then have what he called an oxygen debt, and that debt had to be replenished. So his concept was to deliver supernormal or excessive amounts of oxygen delivery by excessive resuscitation. And this was very popular for about 10 years. It was subjected to about 7 different trials, and there was no ultimate difference. The problem is it caused a lot of excessive fluid and swelling and compartment syndromes. So in many ways, it harmed more than it actually helped. But again, another story in our pursuit of the ideal resuscitation strategy. Now, another concept that came along goes back to World War I, and Dr. Shafton picked up on the concept that had been brought forth by Walter Cannon, that if you resuscitate before you have surgical hemostasis, that was a bad thing. Dr. Maddox picked up on that as well. And again, this is this concept that if you inject fluid that raises blood pressure before you have hemostasis by ligation of blood vessels, et cetera, you can pop the clot and actually make the bleeding worse. So they designed a clinical trial that was published in the New England Journal in 1994 to demonstrate that early resuscitation should be limited, and led to this concept of low volume initial resuscitation, which we're still, even today, trying to sort out. I'll show you some of that in a moment. This concept, although it is probably correct and most patients can tolerate it, certainly has to be done carefully, because in a head injured patient, we know, for instance, that hypotension can make an outcome worse. So what's been adopted in many circumstances is that initially, to avoid this concept of popping the clot, to limit resuscitation to a blood pressure of 80 to 100, and that may have a role, and we'll talk about that further in a moment. Well, we're now in the 70s and early 80s. Trauma systems have been developing. We were slowly, because of ATLS and regionalized trauma system, we were seeing sicker patients in hospitals in the civilian side. And as a result of aggressive surgery and aggressive resuscitation, it became clear that you could operate too much and you could over-resuscitate a patient, induce hypothermia, acidosis, and coagulopathy, and create a situation that even though you could get through repairing the injuries, the patient could not survive the physiologic insult. So that led to the concept of damage control surgery. And very simply in that, what we did is, while resuscitating, we limited the amount of surgery so that the ongoing bleeding was limited, and restored the patient at least enough so that there was not active bleeding, temporarily closed the patient, and then spent the several hours subsequently resuscitating the patient with coagulation, repairing their coagulation, restoring their hemodynamics, restoring their oxygen delivery, and warming them. And when a patient's in better shape, then take them back and perform the definitive surgery. This led to a major revolution in understanding, and it allowed us to start to determine factors that were known to trigger the indications for damage control. And the strategy, again, became to select patients, do an appropriate assessment, stop the surgical part of the operation once hemostasis was established, and focus on restoration of physiology and establishing coagulation. So that became the focus of resuscitation in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, up to this point, most of the work that had been doing this was empiric, based on very small clinical trials, based on observations occurring during wartime, which were adopted once those physicians went back into civilian practice. But we really didn't have an organized way to do clinical trials. And in 2003, a number of us met to create what became the Clinical Resuscitation Research Clinical Trial Network, known as the ROC, or the Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium. This was established in 2005, and for about 12 years did many clinical trials throughout the United States and Canada. It used over 194 hospitals and essentially studied resuscitation strategies on 24 million citizens, or about 7% of the US population. And I want to just spend the rest of my time going through some of these questions we've raised based on our history, and then talk a little bit about what research has allowed us to help understand. So let's start with this concept of should we resuscitate, going back to Walter Cannon's concept that while there's a hole in a named blood vessel, what's the best fluid resuscitation strategy to keep the patient alive until hemostasis can be achieved and to actually promote survival? Again, this has been alluded to. It's been studied in animal models. Dr. Maddox's trial in the 90s tried to address this, but it's still been an unresolved question. And so we did a small trial with 200 patients and were able to demonstrate by limiting the fluid resuscitation to 250 cc's until surgical hemostasis occurred, there was a reduced mortality. And this is now being subjected to a much larger clinical trial to see if this can be, these results can be duplicated and amplified. In the meantime, a strategy has also emerged to what to do while you're getting surgical hemostasis and while you're waiting for the opportunity to definitively resuscitate. What can you do to ebb the flow of bleeding? And Dr. Jacobs, working with the Hartford Consensus in the last 10 years, created a program called Stop the Bleed. And that's designed to teach citizens, paramedics, and everybody that deals with the patient before they actually get to the hospital some basic principles in using tourniquets and pressure to stem the tide of bleeding and try and limit the amount of bleeding that occurs. Let's go next to where we stand with crystalloid resuscitation, the use of colloid. There's been an interest in hypertonic saline as a form of crystalloid for some reasons we'll talk about, and see where do we stand with that today. And the idea of hypertonic saline goes back to some work in my own laboratory about 30 years ago when we were trying to isolate a suppressive factor. And what we realized is that the high concentration of sodium that was part of the experiments in and of itself caused the immune cells, T lymphocytes and polymorphonucleoleucocytes, to be suppressed. And that got us interested. There was also an advantage to hypertonic saline because of its increased sodium concentration. You can resuscitate with a smaller volume. But the concept of an immunologic effect was also very intriguing. This can be explained by understanding that there turns out to be an osmoreceptor on the surface of inflammatory cells, and that can actually be affected by the external sodium concentration and down-regulate those inflammatory cells. And that's actually a part of following shock, what happens to patients is that they get an overwhelming inflammatory response, which in and of itself can be a problem and actually cause subsequent mortality. If you look on the right upper part of this slide, you can see slides of two sections of pulmonary parenchyma. And one is from an animal that was hemorrhaged, resuscitated with normal saline, and then given sepsis. And the one at the bottom is a animal that was resuscitated with hypertonic saline and then given sepsis. And what you see is the subsequent effect of sepsis on the lungs was actually affected by how the animal was resuscitated several days early. And again, that can be explained by this concept that the hypertonicity can downregulate the inflammatory cells. We don't have time to go into all that data, but basically it's actually inhibiting the expression of adhesion molecules on cells. It decreases hydrogen peroxide production. So a lot of the damaging effects of inflammatory cells can be regulated or attenuated by how you resuscitate. That became a whole new way to think about resuscitation fluid that created a lot of excitement. We then studied that in normal volunteers and could demonstrate the same effect. And then Eileen Bulger in Seattle was able to show that in a small trial that you could reduce the amount of ARDS that occurred by resuscitating with hypertonic saline. So that then led the FDA and the NIH to do a large-scale clinical trial to see if hypertonic saline would be a superior crystalloid resuscitation strategy. Lots of excitement, but then the clinical trial was done. And this may be the most important slide I show you today, particularly as students, in that all that data that showed this was a great strategy seemed to be something that would work. There was great physiologic and animal data to support it. When it was subjected to a definitive, prospective, randomized clinical trial, it did not change mortality. And that's despite the fact that the inflammatory effects were actually affected by this, but it did not change the outcome of mortality. And as a result, this is a strategy has not caught on and shows you so importantly how important it is to do clinical research before we change our practice. Now, what about colloid? Again, a lot of interest over the years. It goes back almost 100 years. The bottom line is that although it does have potentially a logistic advantage in that it can resuscitate with a smaller volume because of the oncotic effect that crystalloid or the colloid creates, it has no superiority to crystalloid. And in some trials, it actually has made things worse. So for the time being, standard crystalloid, either Ringer's lactate or normal saline, is what is still used. There has been a lot of interest in hemoglobin as a molecule that could not only add oncotic pressure, but it could carry oxygen. And this has gone on with the concept of what's the advantage of resuscitating with hemoglobin solutions. And the most developed product that's been tested today, although there are several others that are under development, is a product that was developed by a company called Northfield. And they took outdated blood, they lysed the red cells. As you know from medical school, 2,3-DPG is what allows the offloading ability of a hemoglobin molecule to be regulated. And so you can modify hemoglobin once it's taken outside of the red cell membrane to restore the so-called P50, which was done. And this product had a very attractive P50. It had a good shelf life, and it seemed like it would be a superior product to normal saline or Ringer's lactate itself. So we did the definitive trial. We were involved in this along with the group in Denver. And again, a lot of effort, a lot of energy put into this, a lot of very real excitement that this would be something that we had finally found that would add value to patients. But when you do the clinical trial, there ultimately was no difference. And although this work has continued, this is still not the magic solution that we thought it would be. Well, this brings us back to blood. And we've been talking about this on and off for the last 3,000 years. Really, our ability to seriously consider transfusion is only about 250 years old, and really only about 100 years old after World War I. But what has been the current status? And the current status has been really to use component therapy, and for good reason. We talked about what came out of the Vietnam conflict and the contributions of Dr. Simmons in creating a rationale for how we resuscitate. Theoretically, you can reconstitute whole blood from component therapy if you need to. So, you know, why would you want to do that necessarily? And even the standard transfusion guidelines from the College of the American Pathologists or the English Blood Bank Service demonstrate that you should only give plasma when the INR is out of kilter, or give platelets when the count is less than 50,000, and cryoprecipitate when the fibrinogen is less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. And those are what we have all used for decades. But what happened that changed this was, again, a wartime scenario, this time in Iraq, where early aggressive whole blood restoration was accompanied by a reduction in mortality when you had casualties with multiple sites of bleeding. Remember, the early casualties in this war were due to IEDs or explosive devices that would blast multiple extremities at once and cause diffuse bleeding. Those casualties had an increased survival when you aggressively restored fresh frozen plasma, platelets, and red cells and gave that very, very early. Or even better, you gave whole blood from a transfusion partner that a soldier would have. So that observation was then repeated in many civilian sectors as well, and the concept of one-to-one resuscitation was born. But again, until it was subjected to a clinical trial, it would have been a mistake to overreact to that. So this same network worked together. We created a prospective randomized study that was done in the early 210 to 214, and it compared restored component therapy 1:1:1 to lesser ratios. And that paper was then published about 5 years ago. And what it showed is there was no change in mortality, but it did show that patients in the 1:1:1 group achieved hemostasis and fewer experienced death due to exsanguination in the first 24 hours. That's a very important contribution. First of all, it suggests that there is an opportunity for this. Secondly, it suggests that the endpoints that the FDA uses and that we've used in clinical trials may not be best served by 30-day mortality. And as a result, a more recent analysis of this and a publication is pending that will be used to work with the FDA to reconsider how resuscitation trials are done going forward. Now, there are a lot of other things we could talk about, and we just don't have time to. So I want to try and at this point then summarize what we've come through to give you a perspective of where we stand with resuscitation. One of the things we've said is that without a research network, we're not going to be able to really make progress in this area. And that couldn't be truer today than it has been for the last 100 years. And so one of the strategies that this group has been working on is to get sustainable funding to do clinical trials. And part of the National Trauma Care System Act to create zero preventable deaths, as called for by the Institute of Medicine, calls for a significant research infrastructure to be able to promote these kinds of trials. I want to just spend then a couple minutes concluding what I've tried to go through with you. Resuscitation is essential for patients that are bleeding or certainly other areas of disease in critical illness. And we've had an ambivalence about this topic for a long, long time. Having said that, religion, economics, the logistics of a wartime situation, and our knowledge of shock have influenced how we practice, what we've used to resuscitate patients with, what we've believed in. And repeatedly, wartime injuries have been an opportunity to test a practice, test a theory of shock, and then make modifications based on that experience. What we can say today is this concept of an early coagulopathy is real. We need better indicators. We don't want to overdo resuscitation with patients that don't need it. But the reconstitution of blood earlier is likely to save lives, and we've got to do a better job of identifying that. There's also a need to target the effects of shock and under resuscitation on gut and organ response, and using that as a strategy for resuscitation and thinking about things to add to it holds real promise. But again, the thing that I wanted to expose you to in particular about this topic is the importance of clinical trials. In my own career, so many things that I've gotten excited about in the research area that have seemed so logical and really promising for therapeutic use in patients have turned out to not work out when you actually try the definitive trial. So you've really got to be willing, if we're going to best serve our patients, to create protocols that are based on true evidence and generate the evidence through clinical trials to do so. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today, and hopefully we'll have a little time for some questions.
Dr. Hoyt, thank you so much. That was a wonderful, interesting presentation, and we really, really appreciate your participation. I think that you're here with us now, and so I'd like to open up the floor for questions. I think you can either unmute yourself and ask your question, or you can submit it through the chat function as well. Maybe I could start with a question that's not necessarily directed towards Dr. Hoyt, but more to people on the ground in Puerto Rico. Have you guys had exposure to the Stop the Bleed campaign? I'm seeing some heads nodding, so
Yeah,
I'm glad to hear
hopefully
that.
people will be able to pick that up. That program has been affected a little bit by the need for social distancing, but we would love to help you develop that, and it's very inexpensive. It's actually free to put on. The equipment you need to teach somebody is very inexpensive, and I think now as we're moving past COVID, we're going to be able to get back to doing that.
Anyone else with any questions?
David, this is Richard Lynn.
Hey, Richard.
Thank you for bringing this to the students in Puerto Rico. It was an outstanding talk. Really just summarized the whole thing from beginning to end, and I think it's important for the students to realize that surgery is a whole compendium, if you will, from obviously in the operating room and the technical aspects of what we do, but there's so many things that are involved in as a surgeon, if you will, and probably the single most impressive for the students to know is what you're doing and what you've done, Dave, for the world of surgery over the past over a decade now as being the executive director and leading the family of surgery, if you will, through some challenging and difficult times. And so thank you for all you do for worldwide surgery and for us in the American College of Surgeons.
Thanks, Richard. You know, I chose to talk about resuscitation because a lot of this was tracking what I got involved in my own personal life. And I think as medical students, you kind of wonder, how do you get certain places? Um, and what's the trajectory as you start to think about where you want to put your time and energy. And I would just encourage you to sort of see how really exciting a long career, if you choose academics, can be. Not everything is going to be successful, but it's being part of something and something that's relevant to your patients. If you can find that kind of balance, you're going to be happy. And if you go into clinical practice, you're going to have the same kind of thing. You're going to constantly be challenging yourself, but it's really amazing what you're all going to be capable of doing. So don't set your sights too low.
Well said.
Hi, Dr. Hoyt. We have a question in the chat from Carlos Perez, and he asks, is there any preclinical research looking at the effect or hypertonic selling in platelet adhesion or activation, or there is any translational or clinical research?
Yeah, I think the question is this subject dead, or is there still a possibility? And I still, believe in the biology. There are cells that can live in an osmolarity of over 2,500 osmoles, which, at the bottom of the ocean, there are things that are living that live in that kind of environment, and they've adapted cell receptor mechanisms to be able to survive and still process oxygen. So, conceptually, to think about the use of ions like sodium or potassium to actually manipulate the performance of an inflammatory cell, I think is a very, very worthwhile concept. In head injury, hypertonic saline has also been potentially very useful to control intracranial swelling. So, it's not over. It's not a simple problem. And like with anything else in research, you've got to be willing to do that next trial and that next trial. But there are still people that are very interested in it. The transplanters have gotten interested in this as a way to, if you take a organ that's been taken out and you perfuse it with hypertonic preservation solutions, the organs seem to do better. There's less endovascular hemostasis and platelet plugging that occurs. So there are absolutely biologic ideas that are still alive, and we'll just have to continue to do the work.
So
Yeah,
Fernando Rivera has a question. Fernando, do you want to ask the question or do you want us to ask it? Hi, Dr. Hoyt, Jody Bori. Thank you for being with us. So I'll ask Fernando's question if Fernando's not on. I don't know if Fernando's on. Okay. Okay, I'll ask the question. It was stated that every war or conflict has contributed to advances on the medical practice of resuscitation. What can be said of the conflict ongoing with the Middle East right now, and any progress or changes in current procedure or protocols?
Yeah, that's a good question. And philosophically, since the Greeks, the statement has been perhaps the one good thing that comes out of war is an advance in medical care. And I think that's true. It's sometimes hard to find that, but there have been a lot of innovations that have occurred and continue to go on. Some of them have been in the logistics of developing trauma systems and centers so that you can take casualties from the field and take them upstream and provide them care in a timely fashion. So that's sort of a logistic area. The whole treatment of blast injury to the manifestations that occur in the lungs or with head injury, that kind of thing have had innovations based on this. In the area of resuscitation, there's still a lot of work being done to better define and understand the biology of what's actually affected during massive injury and bleeding that affects coagulopathy, so that you can better intervene at an appropriate time with the things we've talked about, but also better understand what the actual deficit is. There have been recent trials using plasma early in the field instead of waiting till you get to the ER. There have been attempts to measure physiologically the status of acidosis in patients as an indicator of somebody that's already developed anaerobic metabolism from hypovolemia and a switch to anaerobic metabolism. So there's constantly things that are being looked at, and there's a very, very strong group in the U.S. Armed Forces now that's still very committed to research. We work with them in the college, actually. But I think it is true that just like we've learned with COVID, COVID's not a war, but in a lot of ways, we've had to treat it that way because it's overtaken all of us, and we've had to drop everything we're doing. And in doing so, we've learned a lot of things. We've, if nothing else, we've learned what we're doing tonight. You can actually educate each other 1,500 miles apart and use technology to communicate in ways that we didn't think were possible. So, you know, when there's a social issue, whether it's a war or a major pandemic like we're experiencing, once we get beyond sort of the initial shock of it, there are always innovations that come about, and there continue to be innovations coming out of war, but also from a pandemic like we're experiencing now.
Dr. Hoyt, if you have time for one more question,
Sure.
because we've been trying to impress upon the students here that overcoming adversity is definitely a part of getting through medical school and residency and in our careers as physicians. We were wondering if you might be able to share with us one of the challenges that you faced in your career and just give us some insight into how you overcame that.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's so many things going on today that are can be thought of as adversity. The issues of you know, the diversity of people, whether it's based on sex or skin color or religion, et cetera, that's one form of it. And that certainly plays into certain people being more or less advantaged. But I actually believe that the challenge in a profession is also a tremendous stressor. And, you know, we are a profession. You are part of the chosen profession that you've chosen, medicine, because you have a responsibility that goes beyond just being human and being kind to one another and working together as a society. You have a responsibility to keep yourself as skilled and as able to provide the specialty and the services that you provide as a physician or a surgeon. And that's a tremendous responsibility. And it takes an incredible discipline in learning, which you're all experiencing now. You question yourselves throughout it. When you're tired, I still remember, you know, the first time I stayed up all night and the next morning wondered what sledgehammer had just hit me. And then I ended up spending my entire career staying up all night because I loved it. So you can't, you know, you can't predict. What you have to do is spend a lot of time in front of the mirror looking at yourself, particularly when you're at this point in your lives, and ask yourself, what do you really want? And you're the only one that can decide that. But I can tell you, if you choose correctly and you pick something that really stimulates you, and you're all experiencing that now, you just tend to listen to each other, or you shy away from this or that based on what you've heard. But try not to do that. Try to be genuine with yourself and really go after those things that light your fire, that give you that sense of passion, that you can really connect to. I really want to do that and help people in that way. If you can find that and become successful at that, you'll never have an unhappy day in your life. You can still have plenty of time to get married and have family and kids and all those other things. And you want an example of that, take a look at Dr. Lin. I mean, he's got most, robust families I've ever seen. But that sense of professional satisfaction and connection you have to really ultimately serve your patients, it's irreplaceable. But you've got to find that and got to pick the right thing to do. So that's a very private decision, but that would be my best advice as a way to overcome adversity. The rest will take care of itself.
Would you have time for one or two more questions?
Yeah, sure. No, I got nothing but time.
All right, sounds great.
Jorge had one question.
Yes, hi, Gabriel Ramos here from Ponce. Nice to meet you, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Hoyt, for that wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask you, not so much as to the content of the presentation, but something that stems out of it. I think the most interesting thing about the entire presentation is the role that research played in all these discoveries and transitioning all the aspects of resuscitation throughout the years. I think that clinical research really powers clinical management and all the decisions that we make. And since this is a presentation for Puerto Rico, I think that's one of our biggest weak links here might be the research. So as the president of the American College of Surgeons, what do you believe might be the role of improving research in places like Puerto Rico so that we can bring up the level of academics here that be up to par with the main places in the States, and that probably put the residents and the students on the same measuring scale?
Yeah, great question. And by the way, I'm the executive director, not the president. We honor the president. I don't think, research is being looked at today as being less emphasized than it was when I was in training. When Dr. Lin and I were in training, a lot of people went into community practice, but if you're going to stay in academics, it was just expected you would do research. But that's not enough. The wisest advice I got was from one of my mentors many years ago. And he basically advised me to think about what clinical area that I was interested in. And you all probably have some inclinations about that. But then if you're going to plan to do research or have an interest in research, to do two additional things. One is to find a topic within that specialty you're interested in that is interesting to you as a research topic. And then the second is to get some formal training in how you go about doing that kind of research. Now, that can be getting an advanced degree. That's not necessary. It can be spending time in a laboratory so you really learn how to do certain things. Today, a lot of people are interested in outcomes research, and that can be getting some formal training in statistics and the evaluation techniques. But to do research well it's a discipline, just like learning surgical technique. And it's not for everybody necessarily, but if it is for you, then you have to be genuine about it and you have to go for it. If you do that, the money will come. And I believe that for a society like Puerto Rico, where there may not be as much infrastructure, but the generation that's coming up, if they dedicate themselves to it, those that do will find a way to find support. There's plenty of support in the United States that can be accessed by anybody that has access to that. But the biggest problem is people, rather than just talking about it, is dedicating some time to actually learn how to do it correctly and then participating. So that's my answer. And the only thing I can tell you is it actually, just like the joy of operating or the joy of taking care of patients, research can be a wonderfully stimulating thing if you have a likeness to it. So I would really encourage people to do it. I think it constantly adds to your way in which you care for your patients and the way you think about your profession. It's not, people like to say, oh, there's not time to do that and all that kind of thing today. I just don't agree with that. And I have many, many colleagues around the country that I grew up with that followed the same path that I did. And we were very, very busy clinically. We were very, very busy in teaching, had lots of responsibilities, but we found the time to also participate in research. So I would encourage every one of you to think about it and at least give yourself a chance to think about the possibilities, because you may be pleasantly surprised.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hoyt, again, for joining us and giving this amazing lecture. I wanted to let everyone know that our next cyber speaker series will be 2 weeks from now on October 5th. It will be Dr. Sandra Freewold on colorectal disease. I'm gonna post the flyer on our social media, and it's gonna be the same drill. You just have to fill out the Google form and you'll get the the Zoom link, sorry. So now we're going to do the bingo for the fixed crops. So Jody has the numbers and she's gonna get me that number, and I'm gonna go to the spreadsheet and see who the winner of the giveaway.
Okay, so just so that we know it, this is live drawing here. There's no tainting here. Okay, so here we go. Here's the number. Number 41. Can you see that?
41 is, getting there. Patricia Mulero from Ponce.
Is Patricia on the call? Is Patricia on the call?
Can you write something on the chat? Yeah, okay. You got it.
Hey, Patricia. Patricia, if you could just stay on and we'll get your contact information.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us. We're gonna post the next cyber lecture series flyers on our social media, so you can stay tuned and join us for the next activities we're gonna be having. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hoyt.
Okay, have a great one, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.